Chapter 19 of Captain Bill McDonald, Texas Ranger, A Story of Frontier Reform. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captain Bill McDonald, Texas Ranger, A Story of Frontier Reform by Albert Bigelow Paine. A Bit of Farming and Politics. Captain Bill and His Goats. The Car Shed Convention. There were to be plenty of real alarms soon enough, with plenty of desperately hard work. Before taking up this part of the story, however, it may not be out of place to dwell briefly on certain other labors and interests incident to this period in Captain McDonald's career. The ranch on Wanderer's Creek, conducted for the most part by his plucky wife, remained one of his possessions, and in time became not unprofitable. McDonald was one of the first to break land in that section, and when he put in a sowing of wheat, it was thought that he had gone daft. But the following year, when the plowed land turned off a crop of from 20 to 30 bushels to the acre, those who had been first to scoff were likewise the earliest to imitate. Captain Bill now became chief promoter in a plan for the irrigation of this fruitful soil, the water to be obtained by damming Wanderer's Creek. Several years later, two men of influence and substance, Cecil Lyon and Joseph Rice, gave able support to this project, with the result that thousands of acres of grazing land became fertile farms, the cowman's domain passing into the hands of tillers of the soil. The town of Quanah reflected the steady agricultural increase, and what had been an antelope range when McDonald and his wife first drove their herds to that region became a bustling city, in due time law-abiding, with a population steadily increasing to this day. The mention of the McDonald herds opens a way here for recording an incident connected with the stocking of the Wanderer's Creek range. McDonald and his wife had decided that they would raise goats as a sort of by-product, and begin business in this line by introducing a flock of considerable size. However, it was a mistake. The goats were a great nuisance. They would be feeding quietly on the range, when suddenly, without warning, they would be seized with an impulse for violent exercise, and would break away and go racing over the prairie for 7 or 8 miles, to the breaks of the Pease River, where it was very mountainous and hilly, altogether in accord with the goat's idea of landscape. All the horses on the range were in danger of being run to death chasing goats, getting them together and bringing them back to the range. Finally, it got to be a regular occupation, when there was nothing else to do, to head for the Pease River and chase goats. One of the men came in one morning when Captain Bill happened to be at home, and asked, "Well, Cap, what shall I do today?" "Oh, I don't know. Go chase goats, I reckon." "All right, but if you want me to do that, you'll have to get you some goats. I rode all my horses down a couple of days ago, hunting for them in the breaks, and there ain't a goat to be found within 40 miles. "D'n the goats," said Captain Bill. "I don't care much for goats anyhow." There had been about 200 of them, and for several years afterwards hunters from other states in these wilds used to bring down "mountain sheep" and "antelope," which bore strong resemblance to the flocks which had once been Captain Bill's. It was not long after Captain Bill's appointment as ranger captain that the state political campaign came on. He had never lost his interest in politics since the first awakening in the old Mineola days, when he and Jim Hogg had been ranged against each other, ready to shed blood for their candidates. Now Hogg was governor, and a candidate for re-election, with Bill McDonald ready to show what he could do in the way of gratitude for favors past and present. The convention for the nomination of the state officials was to be held at Houston, and there was a good deal of excitement, as the opposition was likely to be strong, with nominations closely contested. McDonald resolved to be on hand and ready for any condition or emergency. Arriving in Houston, He learned upon investigation that the supporters of Hogg's opponent, George Clark of Waco, had laid a plan to pack the convention with Clark's friends, to occupy it so fully, in fact, that it would be impossible for the regular delegates to get seats. This would make it necessary for them to meet elsewhere, and would cause them to be regarded as bolters from the regular convention. Upon satisfying himself that this was to be the program, Captain McDonald promptly went to his old friend and other leaders, and proposed to take charge of matters. As captain of the Rangers, he was under the governor's orders, and with Hogg's sanction he could use his own methods of preserving the peace and for the prevention of scrambling and riot. The convention was to be held in the car shed, a very large building which had been seated for the purpose. It had a wide entrance to admit cars, and it could easily have been filled and crowded by a mob. Captain Bill's plan was to put a good, capable fence across this wide opening, leaving a narrow passageway for a gate, which would be completely guarded. No one unable to show credentials as a delegate would be permitted to enter until the delegates were in and seated. Governor Hogg approved of the idea, and issued an order accordingly. There was no delay in carrying it out. Captain Bill got some men together, worked all night, and by sunrise the wide gateway of the car shed had been narrowed down to the little wicket gate of official admission. It was a complete surprise to the opposition. The gang that had arranged to rush and pack the convention regarded the barrier and the men delegated to defend it with amazement and profanity. They began with epithets, and these they followed with more tangible missiles, such as umbrellas, old shoes, and handbags. In another part of the state they might have attempted the use of more effective ammunition. As it was, they were obliged to confine themselves to protests more spectacular than effectual. The regular delegates filed in and were seated. Then the crowds were permitted to enter in the usual way, whereupon another convention was immediately organized in the same hall, with another chairman on the same platform, and for a time 2 conventions were running side by side. Captain McDonald was finally called to the platform to preserve order. There was a lively scene. The Ranger was kept busy keeping the 2 factions separate, taking away their knives, a few pistols, canes, umbrellas, and such other weapons and missiles as they attempted to bring into action. The final result was that both Clark and Hogg were nominated, at the same time, in the same convention, and by the same political party, though the Clark followers were styled anti-democrats and bolters. Hogg was re-elected in due time by a good majority. The episode passed into history as the Car Shed Convention. End of chapter 19.